Gandhi was arrested on 10th March 1922, and the trial was held on 18th March, nearly 8 days later. One of the reasons they were able to hold the trial that early is because Gandhi had declared that he and Shankar Lal Bankir, so Shankar Lal Bankir was put on trial alongside him. Who was Shankar Lal Bankir? Shankar Lal Bankir was the publisher of Young India. I will turn to that in a moment. But both of them were going to declare their guilt. And so therefore they didn't need any time to prepare for the trial. And the British likewise, of course, said, well, in this case we'll just expedite the whole thing. And as I said, 8 days after Gandhi is arrested, he's going to be put on trial. Now when Gandhi is put on trial, the charges are sedition. It's a very interesting history to this charge of sedition, because this is a charge that used to be used commonly in Britain against political opponents. But by this time, the charge of sedition was seldom applied in Britain for political offences, if at all. In India, on the other hand, it was not uncommon for the colonial regime to charge an individual with sedition. And the precise charge actually extends to more than sedition, so that when Gandhi and Shankar Lal Bankir were put on trial, they were put on trial on charges of sedition and inciting or attempting to incite the people to have disaffection towards the government of British India. Right? That is to say that the charge in part is that Gandhi and Shankar Lal Bankir are provoking the people towards a hatred, right, of the government, duly established by law, which is how the British thought of themselves, the government of British India. The evidence that the British used was a number of articles that Gandhi had published in Young India. This was the newspaper that Shankar Lal Bankir was the publisher of. Shankar Lal Bankir had first met Gandhi, as I recall, in 1914. And at that time seems to have been wholly unimpressed by him. He seems to have then gone on to a career at what was then the newly instituted Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. But then he was also running the journal, and so he came into much closer contact with Gandhi when Gandhi finally decided that he was going to use a vehicle for the expression of his opinions. And Shankar Lal Bankir certainly had nationalist inclinations, so the two of them came together. It became an extraordinarily fruitful association. And like many others who met Gandhi, Shankar Lal Bankir just absolutely eventually became a loyal disciple and follower of Gandhi. So he is going to be put on trial alongside Gandhi, and the trial is going to be held on March 18th. It's going to be presided over by Justice Broomfield. Francis Watson has written an entire book on the great trial, as it's known. And one of the things he tells us, and he's looked at Broomfield's diary, is that the morning of the trial, Justice Broomfield played a round of golf. So it was a very casual, leisurely start to the morning. The trial is going to be held at 12 o'clock. I had, mentioned the fact that the charges were based on the evidence furnished by a number of articles published in Young India. These articles were published between September and December 1921, as if my memory serves me correctly. One of them is called A Puzzle and Its Solution. The other one is called Shaking the Mains. And I think the third one was called Tampering with Loyalty, because these are the three articles that the British put in evidence. Before I venture to give a description of the trial and what makes it so memorable, it's also important to mention that the prosecutor working on behalf of the colonial state is Sir Thomas Strangman, who had first acquired experience, cut his teeth, so to speak, in 1897, if I recall correctly, when Bal Gangadhar Tilak was put on trial on charges of sedition. And that entire proceeding, so this is the first of the two great trials that Tilak himself had to undergo, the first in 1897, the second, as I recall, in 1906. And in the 1897, the prosecutor was Sir Thomas Strangman. The entire record of that trial has been republished by the government of India, because one of the most extraordinary things about that trial is that there was a number of days, I think it was 6 or 7 days, when Sir Thomas Strangman and Tilak, and Strangman is being assisted by a Marathi interpreter, because the charges there once again were that Tilak had written articles that were sedition in the newspaper Kesari. The difference is that those articles are published in Marathi. So for those 6 days, they're kind of wrangling over the various kinds of interpretations of words that Tilak uses. And Tilak, of course, was a wordsmith, someone who loved to play with language, like Gandhi, a man who was trained in the law. And the British had a very tough time dealing with Tilak. Now, they need not have had that fear, of course, in 1922 for two reasons. When Gandhi was put on trial, one, that Gandhi had already declared his intent to plead guilty. This was quite widely known, I think. And secondly, because the articles are published in English, and moreover, Gandhi had no intention to use his legal skills. He certainly had many of those to wrangle with the English on this occasion. Right? Now, before he's put on trial, when he's actually first charged, he's brought before a magistrate. I think this was the day after he was arrested. And there's a very interesting little detail I'd like to share before we move to the proceedings of March 18th. And that little detail is that he's asked to declare what his profession is. And Gandhi says, farmer and weaver. Now, I think someone listening to this, or having read the biographies of Gandhi where they might have encountered what Gandhi had said, might say that, well, Gandhi was being a little, disingenuous here. I mean, he's really not a farmer, and he's not a weaver, but there is actually literal truth in what Gandhi is saying, apart from the various metaphorical ways in which we can think of Gandhi as someone who prepared the ground as a farmer would, tried to seed it with ideas of Satya and Ahimsa, and tried to seed a new beginning, right? What is the literal truth? The literal truth is that Gandhi very much believed, and this practice goes back to his days in South Africa in growing his own vegetables. So part of that whole experience of living communally in an ashram was having a vegetable patch and people becoming familiar with where the food comes from, right? How it leaves the ground and ends up on your table. And of course, Gandhi was a weaver of tales. Right? He was someone who could spin a yarn, so to speak, once again. And in all of these respects, and given the emphasis that Gandhi attached to handloom weaving, attached to weaving and spinning both as arts and crafts that were essential for Indians to pursue for various ways, his characterization of himself as a farmer and weaver was not inaccurate. Now, the trial begins at noon on March 18th. Here is a painting by Moshin Shakil. He seems to be an Ahmedabad-based artist. I don't think anyone has ever written on this painting. It's a painting that has, unlike everything else in this room, it seems to have withstood the test of time. It's quite possible that the painting was done only a couple of decades ago when I last visited the Circuit House. It was about 12 years ago, and I recall a painting from that time. And of course, you see Gandhi here in his loincloth. He would have been dressed in this way because it is in 1921 in Madurai that Gandhi essentially adopted, if we can put it this way, this costume, right? That the Gandhi was increasingly going to strip himself of clothes, and then in 1921 the loincloth is what he adorns himself with, no headwear, and often, of course, he would go around bare-chested. Now, Justice Broomfield had been in India for some years at this time, and we could say that perhaps it was Justice Broomfield's great fortune that he was going to put Gandhi on trial, just as we could say that it was Gandhi's good fortune that he had a person who was very civil and civilized and generous and gracious to preside over the trial. It is on record that when Gandhi walked into the courtroom, the entire court stood up. This is a scene that, of course, is depicted in Attenborough's film from 1982, and it has sometimes been suggested that Justice Broomfield himself rose from his seat. I think that's quite unlikely because the last person who usually enters the courtroom is the justice. But there may well be the case that he also rose from his seat when Gandhi entered. We certainly do know that when the trial ended, Justice Broomfield said that I'm well aware of the fact that it is very unlikely that I will ever preside over a trial of this kind in the future, or that anyone else will preside really over a trial of this kind in the future. He says, I'm well aware of the fact that you are revered by your countrymen, that in their eyes you are a saint. Right? And Broomfield says that I, as a judge, am bound to follow the law. You broke the law, you have declared yourself guilty, and therefore I have the duty to inflict a sentence on you. And Gandhi asks that the maximum possible sentence for the offense be given to him. Right? And these are some of the other things that makes this trial extraordinary, absolutely unusual, as I said, in the annals of political history. And then Broomfield says that, well, I'm going to deliver a sentence of 6 years on you. And Gandhi says that, well, this was the same sentence that was passed on Tilak. What a great honor for me. And Broomfield concludes by saying that, well, if it should ever become possible to shorten your sentence or have you released early, no one would be more pleased than me to be able to pass that order. But let's go back now to just 2 or 3 features of this trial and 1 or 2 sentences that are really embedded in my memory forever. So the prosecutor, Sir Thomas Craignan, expects that there's going to be a very long trial, but Gandhi and Shankarlal Banker both plead guilty, and then Gandhi asks permission to read out a sentence, a statement that he had prepared, a written statement that he had prepared. The judge accedes to his request, and then Gandhi will proceed to read out the statement. Before the statement is read out, the government has laid their case very briefly, mentioned these articles from Young India that I had talked about, articles in where Gandhi is essentially telling the people that you have an obligation, right, to be disloyal to this government. This government has done nothing for you, it oppresses you, and we have been led to death by this government. Right? So he's preaching disaffection, he's preaching sedition. I think hatred would be too strong a word, but this is partly what disaffection means, at least from the standpoint of the government, that he's inciting people to hatred towards the government, not an individual Britisher. This should be noted, right? Gandhi's critique is going to be a critique of the institutionalized system of oppression inflicted by the British upon India. Now what Gandhi is going to do in his written statement, he's going to say that, look, I've always wanted to avoid violence. More than anything else, I want to avoid violence. I've always stood by non-violence, stood by the idea of ahimsa and by the idea of satya. And I was, in fact, so what he's going to say is that I was, in fact, in the early years of my association with the British, I was a loyalist. I was a staunch cooperator. And he's going to describe the journey that takes him from being a staunch cooperator to a staunch non-cooperator. And that's the political journey that he's going to describe. That there was a time when he thought that Indians could acquire political rights under the British Empire on equal terms as white people. But then he comes to the realization that no, this is a system that is deeply rooted in certain forms of racism and discrimination. Right? So that's the journey that he's going to describe. And what are some of those memorable lines there? I just want to share two of those lines. I'm not going to describe the entire journey. And remember, this is 1922. So we still have another 26 years before Gandhi is assassinated. Of course, the Salt March has not taken place. The Quit India movement has not taken place. What Gandhi is describing here is the altered circumstances after 1919, after the Rowlatt Satyagraha and after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of April 1919 in the city of Amritsar in Punjab, which finally convinced him that Indians had no future under the British Empire, that India would never be treated even remotely on equal terms as the white colonies of, let's say, Canada and Australia. And so, of course, this is before the demand for Purna Swaraj, full independence, which is a demand that is going to be voiced in late 1929 and is then going to lead to, right, the unfurling of the flag, the demand for full independence, Purna Swaraj, in January 1930. Right? This is well before all of that, but you can see in this proceedings here the road to self-determination. So what are some of those memorable lines? Just two of them. One of the things that Gandhi says here is, he says that no sophistry, no jugglery of numbers can disguise the bare evidence before the naked eyes of the skeletons that you find in Indian villages. What is he referring to? He's referring to the fact that India has been racked by famines under colonial rule. Right? And the British are disguising all of this. They're suggesting, well, people have died, it's famines, it's plagues. I've elsewhere written that between 1875 and 1925, in that period of half a century or 50 years, there is an excess mortality of 100 million in India. And a large part of this had to do with the famines induced by British policies in India. Now, Gandhi is saying that the British seek to disguise all of this. They're going to release statistics which are going to suggest that, well, India is not doing so badly. And what Gandhi is saying is that the British have vastly underdeveloped India. They have led a trail of ruin and destruction, and you can see the skeletons in the villages, the skeletal figures in Indian villages. And that's what he says when he says, no sophistry, no jugglery of numbers can disguise the evidence before your eyes presented by these skeletons, by the dilapidated state of Indian villages. Right? And then he says that, look, we have to understand, and this is the sentence he uses, and with the discussion of this sentence, I'm going to conclude this talk. He says, affection cannot be manufactured or regulated by law. Meaning what? Meaning that we can't love the British. The British rule over us, right? But it's impossible. It's impossible to love the British. We don't have to commit violence against them, but nor do we have to love them. But of course, the meaning of this sentence is much wider in scope, because what he's really saying is this, that ultimately a state cannot change things in a society simply by imposing laws. The law can tell a person, you must not discriminate against a lower caste person. The law, and if you do, the law might stipulate that this is a criminal offense. So if a person who is a low caste person comes and applies for a job and you discriminate against a person, and it can be proven that you've discriminated against that person, well, that might be an offense, punishable by law. But the law cannot tell you that you must love a lower caste person, or you must love a religious minority, or you must love a person who belongs to a different religious or linguistic or caste group. Right? So this is the meaning of what Gandhi is saying, because he's saying that in order to understand how change takes place in a society, we have to very much keep in mind that this change has to come from the bottom up. And he says that whatever the British have done in India, an affection has not developed between their people and our people. And that cannot be the basis for anyone ruling over another group of people. So this law, this trial, which took place over a period of about 90 minutes, that was the entire length of the trial, ends, as I said, with Justice Bloomfield handing down the sentence of 6 years on Gandhi. Gandhi did not serve out the 6 years. He was released in February 1924. He had served less than 2 years. I've jokingly said that one of the reasons why he was released earlier is because often people get released when they exhibit good behavior. Now, you can't imagine Gandhi not exhibiting good behavior while he was in prison. But he was really released early on because he needed an emergency appendicitis. And the British view was that Gandhi now has become a spent force. In fact, the Viceroy at that time, Lord Reading, when the sentence was passed on Gandhi and Gandhi is put behind bars, he said, I think this is pretty much the end of Mr. Gandhi. And I don't need to deliver a judgment on Lord Reading's very optimistic assessment of what the British had achieved at this trial, because we know what transpires in the next 25 years. Reading is not even a footnote now in history, and we know what Mohandas becomes to the rest of the world. And it is said by some of his biographers, including his biographer Tendulkar, who wrote this 8-volume biography of Gandhi, that when the proceedings came to an end, people bowed down, took Gandhi's blessings, and Sarojini Naidu was among those who were present in the courtroom. It would have been this room itself, was present in that courtroom. And Sarojini Naidu essentially compares him at this point with Jesus and with Socrates, right? And this is the tone on which the trial ended.